Patroclus returns to Achilles and begs Achilles to send him out to fight in Achilles' armor. Homer writes, "So Patroclus pleaded, lost in his own great innocence, condemned to beg for his own death and brutal doom." Achilles comes to understand his rage cannot last forever, but he recalls his promise not to fight until the cries and carnage reached his own ships. Thus, Achilles agrees and sends Patroclus with his armor and the Myrmidons to fight. However, Achilles tells Patroclus to only fight the Trojans off the Argive ships and not to pursue them back to Troy, because that may diminish his glory, the fame of Achilles. Homer notably invokes the Muses to help him sing about the burning of the Achaean ships. Ajax is unable to stop Hector and his men from setting the ship ablaze, and Achilles sees the flames and sends out Patroclus with the Myrmidons. The Trojan columns buckle upon seeing Patroclus, who they believe is Achilles, as Patroclus bears all of Achilles' war gear save his spear. Thus Patroclus and the Argives set upon the Trojans like ravenous wolves upon lambs. Sarpedon, the son of Zeus, is slain by Patroclus, and Glaucus, strengthened by Apollo, rallies his fellow Trojans to secure Sarpedon's body. Similarly, Patroclus rallies Ajax and the Argives to the body of Sarpedon, the first to storm the Argive wall, to mutilate him, shame him, and tear his gear from his back. Thus the body of Sarpedon, the son of Zeus, becomes lost under the mass of weapons, blood, and dust. Zeus makes Hector a coward, and the Trojan prince calls for a retreat. The Achaeans win the body of Sarpedon, but Zeus sends Apollo to rescue the body before it can be mutilated. Patroclus, not heeding the command of Achilles, pushes his assault onward toward Troy. Apollo repels Patroclus's assaults on Troy and warns the warrior that it is not the will of fate that Troy falls to him. Though Apollo strengthens Hector, Patroclus still presses forward, but Apollo sneaks behind him and slams Patroclus to the ground with a slap across the back.
Wow.
Disoriented, Patroclus is then stabbed in the back by Euphorbus, a Trojan, who then retreats. Hector then runs forward and spears Patroclus in the gut. The brazen point went jutting straight out through Patroclus's back. Hector taunts the dying Patroclus, and Patroclus dies prophesying that Hector will soon die too. The last word of Patroclus is Achilles.
Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. A lot going on in this chapter or in this book. A lot of ups and downs, a lot of climatic moments, and a lot of like, what? Are you kidding me? That's how it happens?
Right.
Throughout this book. Buckle up, because I think we're going to have a time limit on this book for only 4 hours.
Right.
We'll cut off at 4 hours, so don't worry about it. But if you haven't had a chance to read this, or you're in the process of reading it with your group, make sure to go to our website, ascendthegreatbookspodcast.com, and you can get all of our study guides, or your guide that you've been diligently making throughout this whole thing. It gives you basically a whole summary that we read like we do it at the beginning, and then gives great questions that way your group can go through and have a good discussion. You don't have to come up with the questions yourself, which is sometimes intimidating when you're not really sure, when it's your first read as well. Right?
Correct.
So there's a lot of things that happen even in this book where you're like, what? And if it's your first time to read it and you're trying to organize and be the leader of a group, it can kind of be a little intimidating on trying to come up with things when you're just trying to read the narrative and you're not kind of being able to dive in deeper into some of the ins and outs of the book.
Yeah, I mean, we're here to help people, right? To accompany them through the great books.
I'm here to help me.
Well, okay. Well, we'll leave that one alone. But yeah, I think again, what's on our heart to help with this process of coming to understand Homer and our year of Homer. You have the podcast, you have the guide, right? Kind of working through this.
Right.
And book 16, like we do, we reach a certain climax in the story. We reach a certain thing that we've been kind of waiting for, that we kind of knew was happening, right? Patroclus fights and dies. And I do think it's a very thick book. It has a lot to offer us.
Mm-hmm.
My first read through, I remember almost like speeding through the text, waiting for this like great duel.
Right.
Like oh my gosh, like Patroclus versus Hector. This is going to be this
Right.
like epic. I'm just it's kind of like Hollywood thing is playing in my mind. And I just remember being so
The documentary.
Right, the documentary, the movie. But yeah, I just remember like this is going to be this like wonderful battle scene, like this this virtue, etc. And then just being how disappointed I was
Right.
with how this book ends, which we explained in the narrative, right? That it basically Patroclus just gets slapped down by Apollo. And I think as I read it this time and other times as well, there's been a certain maturation in my understanding of really a lot of this book book 16 has a lot to deal with human agency, our actions, the will of man, and the will of the gods. And then even the will of the gods in relationship to the nameless fate. So we kind of see this, Patroclus ends up being somewhat of this vessel for the will of Zeus to actually occur. And we'll see some of that. And so I do think like if you read this, you kind of felt like it had a very anticlimactic ending, right? Or you were robbed of some type of like, great battle scene.
Right.
I think you're correct. I think that there's, I think that's very common in that kind of like a first time read. And then as you kind of revisit the text, I do think there's a lot of layers here on why Apollo just slapping down Patroclus, and also just like this very ignoble death, right? Of just like really, we literally get like a random character who just runs out and stabs him,
Right.
and then just retreats and just runs away, right?
Yeah.
Just like comically, cartoonishly runs out, stabs him, runs back,
Right.
And then here just strolls in Hector.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I read this, I was so frustrated because there's times throughout the book, right, where you're trying to track new characters, and you're trying to figure out like who they are. We've talked about this before, but you spend all this time trying to understand who this character is, and then boom, they die. Right? And you're like, that was a lot of time just for them to die. But at least they die this awesome death. Like either like their eyeballs pop out from getting hit in the stone, or they roll down like a log, like with all their limbs taken off.
I forgot about that guy.
There's like some really cool, like Homer sets it up as if this is going to be like the battle to prepare for, like, and it's going to be epic. And so then like when you read it for the first time and the dude like pokes him and then runs away, and then Hector kills him, you're like, wow.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot here that we can start to parse out then about once we kind of get past, if you had that experience, once you kind of get past that initial disappointment with the text, to then ask like, well, if we take seriously Homer the teacher, what then is he trying to teach us? And I think on its face, book 16 has a lot of climactic things about the heroes and Patroclus and Hector and even Sarpedon, right? I mean, Sarpedon dies, which is a major, movement in the plot, if you will. But at the same time, I think on a deeper level, after you kind of remove a few of those layers, there's a lot going on here about the providence of the gods versus the agency of a human being. Then basically, within this kind of dialogue between these two, what is the role of the nameless fate, right? So, okay, so let's get started.
A lot going on.
There's a lot going on. It's a good book. Okay, so Patroclus fights and dies. So one of the things, just like right off the bat, that we notice is that here comes Patroclus, right? So he's running, he's weeping warm tears. He's a sympathetic character because remember, he also had been in the tent, right, taking care of the individual that had been wounded. So here he comes, and he is seeing, right, he's weeping these warm tears because he's seeing the brutality that the Achaeans are suffering, which is a normal human reaction. Let's just take a moment and compare this to Achilles, right? So Achilles just seems dumbfounded, right? Like, why in tears, Patroclus, like a girl? a baby running after her mother, begging to be picked up, and she, tugs her skirts, holding her back as she tries. So he has this like very sarcastic opening, which very clearly he understands what's going on.
Right.
And even the text shows us that as his little monologue here at the beginning ends. If it could get worse, I think it does, right? Where then he actually calls out like, no, I understand why you're actually crying, right? Why you're being a baby girl. You're crying because the Argives are being slaughtered. And his commentary on that is, seeing them die against the hollow ships repaid for their offenses. So he's watching his countrymen get slaughtered. Mm-hmm. And for him, he's like, yeah, I told them this would happen. Right. And again, this is where we see the structure of the text with the prayer of Thetis and et cetera. And so he's waiting. He's waiting until that carnage reaches all the way to his ships, right? So he's just sitting there watching his countrymen die. Some people you think he would have sympathy for, maybe like Ajax, right? Watching giant Ajax with his
He doesn't.
What does he have again? He has that like maritime spear poleaxe that he's like
with a
impaling people on, like 12 Trojans.
How long it's
a wonderful scene, right?
Yeah.
So again, we kind of see this dialogue between Patroclus and Achilles, and I think where the two are and their emotions respective of the war. Then we also get this kind of interesting rhetorical note or style with Patroclus. Patroclus then is the tense shifts, right? So we've got all this kind of third-party talk, like Menelaus does this, then Achilles does this, etc. And now we're getting some of this language of Patroclus, oh my rider. But it's not like in the mouth of Achilles. It's in the mouth of Homer.
That's right.
So Homer is talking about, Patroclus, my rider. And, there's a lot of ink that's spilled, on why he shifts and does this. He does it other places too. One that occurs to me is he does it with Menelaus, I think, once. But I think it portrays a certain intimacy, right, about one, Patroclus's character, and also what Patroclus doesn't realize that he's running into, if that makes sense, right? Okay.
Yeah, and I do like how he opens up not only with Patroclus opens back up answering Achilles, saying not only that things are not going well, but then he gives kind of Diomedes is brought down, Odysseus is wounded, Agamemnon too. Like he gives kind of this like, here's the up to date analysis of what's going on, on the war front, which is nice because I remember reading this for the first time and be like, okay, so Diomedes, that now we know kind of where he is because he kind of vanished for a little while.
Right.
It's like, okay, so he's down, Odysseus is wounded, Agamemnon's down. It was just nice to see, like, he also was concerned, like, listen, these are like our friends, like these are the guys who we're fighting with, and they're all down.
Correct. And so then, we see that Patroclus then, shares this idea, like, well, at least send me into battle. Right. Give me your armor, do these types of things. You mentioned the documentary, which of course is the euphemism for the Troy movie with Brad Pitt. But there's a few notable shifts here, right? And this is the problem with watching these movies is you have to kind of purge them from your imagination. Because if I remember right, like in that one, Patroclus like does this on his own. Right, like he gets the armor and runs out.
Yeah,
and the Myrmidons all follow him because they think they're Achilles, right? And then he dies, and everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, we didn't know who he was."
Right.
There's like a certain element of that, but here, like this is a very intentional decision by Achilles, right? Like he asked permission, and Achilles, down at like line 70, very clearly says, "Yes, you take them." So the Myrmidons know what's going on. Patroclus is sent out. There's a transition here in the text that can be a little bit difficult to trace, but at the beginning, they very clearly think it's Patroclus, they think it's Achilles, right? Because there's they talk about their columns buckle. But then as you move through the text, they realize by the time he gets, speared and these types of things, like Hector very clearly understands that it's Patroclus, right? And even sometimes their dialogue before the death, that this has already been revealed, right, to a certain degree. So,
right. And don't you feel for Patroclus here, right? The guy, he's seeing his guys, his buddies, and the people he's fighting with, like they're all getting wounded. There's a hero that needs to emerge. Achilles is clearly not wanting to do it, and so Patroclus is like, okay, well, next man up, that's me. At least let me get in there. Let me try to win this thing. I know when I was reading this for the first time, I thought like, I can totally relate to how Patroclus was feeling.
Yeah, he is a very sympathetic character. You see this at, what is this, like 53, 55 or so? Homer says, "So he pleaded, Patroclus, lost in his own great innocence, condemned to beg for his own death in brutal doom." And I think this is, kind of maybe taking this as a launching point for a larger question. The question that occurs to me as I read this is this simply, did Patroclus deserve his fate? Right? Like, does he actually deserve the fate that he receives here? Because then Homer uses this term like great innocence and things like this, but I'm not really sure on what level we're supposed to read that in like conjunction with like, why is even Patroclus in Troy, right? And is there an irony about his death? So do you want to like turn to like maybe the guide? Because I think our guide does a really good job of like trying to parse this out a little bit.
Yeah, on why Patroclus
deserves his fate.
Yeah, so it says, on whether Patroclus deserves his fate, many turn to the fact Patroclus disobeyed the advice of Achilles to refrain from assaulting Troy. However, Homer couples that sentiment with the line that the will of Zeus will always overpower the will of man.
So there's like this immediate juxtaposition, right? Because I think that, and we've talked about in the small group, when we asked our question, does Patroclus deserve this fate? I think there's a certain immediacy that people trying to answer that question and say, hey, yeah, look, he was supposed to stop, right? He pushed them off the ships. He was supposed to stop, and then he kept on going.
Right.
I think it's a factor. I think it's a consideration. But then also, the problem is that we also see that like this kind of reduces back down to this question of human agency. To what degree does Patroclus actually have the capacity to not keep pushing on because it's the will of Zeus that's actually pushing him forward? Right? Yeah. No, very good.
Yeah. So he says, others will turn to Patroclus following the advice of Nestor, old boy Nestor, to construe him donning Achilles' armor as an act of pride and folly.
Do you want to give a defense of your boy there at all? Because I mean, this is one of the things where Nestor's advice seems to go really wrong. Right? Is that he said, and it seems almost manipulative, right? So if you think about it, this was in a previous book, right? When Patroclus and Nestor are speaking, it's Nestor that actually plants this idea in Patroclus's head. So when he comes and tells Achilles, I don't think he actually tells Achilles that this was Nestor. I don't think he does. It's back down around like 40, 45. But this is actually Patroclus' idea Nestor's idea. So you've been very strongly on Team Nestor.
Team Nestor, right?
I mean, do you want to give a defense of him at all?
I obviously it's a tough position to be, right? You're in a tough position. I think that the charitable read for Nestor here would be that he's got to be very frustrated with how Achilles is acting, like how things are going down. And we're in year 10, like, so he's thinking something's going to happen here. How do I make this thing go? What's the catalyst that's going to make this thing go? Patroclus is, eager young man trying to make a name for himself. So he plays that heavy. Obviously it's not good advice. The guy can't bat 1,000 every time. But at least he's trying to swing. That would be my charitable read.
Yeah, that's a charitable read. Yeah, I don't, I'm not sure how much I fault Nestor, for his particular advice. I mean, if anyone's going to be faulted here, it's still Achilles, in my opinion. Right?
And okay, if he is as wise as what the book says he is, he knows exactly what he's doing, right? There's an ambitious man that's a warrior that is a good warrior, one of the best, or the best, one of the best, at least. And so he plants the seed in his mind to make this thing go.
Okay, so hold on, let me push into that just for a second.
Okay.
So let's assume that Nestor, so Nestor's really interesting because he, as we've mentioned before, he's a link to an older age.
Right.
He is the kind of primordial understanding of wisdom. Age equals wisdom. Right. So he plays this role of counsel and being prudent. Do you think that his point in telling that to Patroclus was to actually get Patroclus to fight or to prick Achilles into fighting?
Oh, I think that it's the latter. I think that
okay.
But I think that one has to go in order for the latter to happen. I think he knows that Patroclus, in order to get the ball rolling, Patroclus has to go out and fight.
Oh, okay. Do you think though that do you would give any credence to the idea that maybe even Patroclus saying, "Oh, you can send and fight me," or excuse me, you can send me in your armor and I'll fight in your stead. Just that itself might have pricked Achilles into acting, right? Because
I see what you're.
Because you see here, so if you look around like line 70 or so, right, you start getting this language, which is going to be somewhat ubiquitous in the next couple books, where Achilles is like, enough, let bygones be bygones now, done is done, how on earth can a man rage forever? Still, by God, I said I would not relax my anger. Achilles shifts here from rage to pride, right? So he's not raging right at this moment. He has a pride now that's getting pricked about like, wait, well, and so, but then he says, oh, well, Patroclus, you can go out, but don't push too far because you'll diminish my glory. So it almost seems like, I mean, I realize we're speculating, but it almost seems like if you have a really terrible read of Nestor, that he knew this would prick Achilles' pride. Yeah. And unfortunately, and it would steal glory, right? It could steal glory away from Achilles. Unfortunately, Achilles, it doesn't spur him to act directly. He still sends him out, but then in a measured way. Well, okay, we'll just go push out against the ships and then come back, right? Achilles seems to try and limit the capacity for this to turn into, an error. So anyway, it's just kind of curious if we want to give a rich reading to Nestor there, what we think he was trying to do by planting the seed inside of Patroclus.
Yeah, I didn't see it as Nestor thinking that if he invokes Patroclus to go out and fight, that would in turn immediately make Achilles want to go fight. I didn't think that, but I thought like, okay, once Patroclus is out there, and then Achilles, like from the ships looking out there, seeing him fight, it will stir in him, this bloodlust that he has, and he'll go out there and be like, I can't be missing out on this as well.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So, but it does seem like Achilles is very like jealous and has some pride there, where he limits what Patroclus can do because he does not want Patroclus to steal his glory. Yeah,
no, I think there's some good points there. Okay, so we've got Patroclus following the advice of Nestor, and so we're kind of figuring out, well, does Patroclus deserve his fate? Some kind of point to him donning Achilles' armor as an act of pride and folly. I don't. We talked a lot about Nestor. My sympathies there don't lie with that, right? As an act of pride or folly, because I think Patroclus is generally moved by the slaughter of his countrymen.
I do too.
Countrymen, they're being broadly, right? This federation of the Achaeans.
No, I do too. I mean, it's very clear. He's coming to him weeping.
Right. So I don't. Again, if we explore the question, does Patroclus deserve his fate? This kind of ignoble death that he suffered. I don't see it in him donning the armor either. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think that he foresaw that coming. Okay, so let me see. I just got turned around on my notes here. So most convincing, however, Patroclus deserves his fate because he failed his mission. He was sent to Troy to temper the rage of Achilles and provide counsel. Now, can you explain like how that plays out?
Yeah, so I think that the reason I wrote this is because I think this is the best way that I see it, is that it's not anything really in the immediate narrative that explains whether or not he deserves his fate. But it's rather kind of stepping back to this meta narrative, this kind of overarching what was going on in Iliad as a whole, and even before Book 1 starts. And the way I look at it is that, as we've kind of raised prior, is that when it's actually tied to Nestor again, when Patroclus and Nestor are discussing, talking, it's revealed to us that Nestor is the one, I'm going by memory here, but Nestor is the one that actually went to Achilles to try and get him to fight, which included Patroclus. Mm-hmm. And so Peleus, Achilles' father, says yes, and then we get this really interesting insight that basically Patroclus is sent with Achilles, right? That he's his friend, but he's really his attendant, right? He's sent with Achilles to give Achilles counsel and to help temper his rage, right? So Achilles is already known for his anger. And so we are literally reading an epic that starts off with, right, rage, the right? Rage, Muse, sing to me of the rage of Achilles. Right. I have some questions about whether Patroclus actually accomplished his mission, right? The answer there probably being no. So here, like even without all of book one, and you see this narrative falling apart, you see the narrative of Briseis, you see all these things happening. Like my question is, where is Patroclus? Like it's actually shocking when you find out what his goal is, because he clearly has not actually been doing it.
But is it even doable?
Well, that's okay.
I mean,
Not ready to give him a defense yet.
Okay, fair enough. I just think that it's like, come on. Well, okay, yeah. Well, I'll hold it.
So I think that, yes, I would say it's doable, because you could say, well, isn't this not just Zeus's will kicking in again, right? And like this has all been fated, and like Troy, blah 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 blah. And I'm not sure, because we're still prior. Certainly, like I think Troy has already been fated the fall, but Patroclus is already failing in his mission even prior to the prayer of Thetis. Right, so he's already failing, like with the Briseis episode and Agamemnon. Remember, it's not Patroclus that stops Achilles from slaughtering Agamemnon in book one. It's Athena that has to come down, right, and stop him. So I think that in a lot of ways, when I look at this, if I was going to say Patroclus deserves his fate, if I was inclined to say yes, I wouldn't necessarily look at him disobeying Achilles or him donning his armor. I actually much more would actually look at his mission, and that he actually failed in his actual mission to temper Achilles' rage. And then I think we kind of get into, as we'll see in later books, kind of like a thick irony that Homer presents us, that then the death of Patroclus becomes the source of even a greater rage inside Achilles, which will then carry him out throughout the rest of the poem. Right?
It's the domino that falls.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so just out of curiosity for you, the first time you read it, and you read When Patroclus Dies, was that like a letdown for you?
Yes. Yeah. No, very much. As I mentioned earlier, I think all those emotions I shared earlier about first-time readers are drawn from my own experience,
okay.
right?
Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
No, I very much enjoyed in a lot of ways Hector the first time I read through the Iliad, and so now I'm kind of waiting for this giant battle, and also some of the other duels with Hector have been less than satisfying, right? Like some of those things with Ajax and things like that. I think we're about to quit the Iliad because they quit their duel because it got dark outside, right?
That was frustrating.
Right. And so I was kind of expecting this wonderful duel at the end, and it kind of falls flat, and at least as like a primary read. But let's kind of maybe look at that about, does he deserve this? I think one thing that really caught my attention on this read through is that Patroclus goes, let's see, where would this be? So let's look at 805, right? So line 805.
Okay.
So this is Patroclus, and he is pushed out all the way to the gates of Troy, right? So he's not obeying Achilles' command. He is pushed all the way up. And actually, right, it actually tells us the Achaeans might have taken Troy. So this again leads into that narrative that they don't actually really need Achilles to take Troy, right? That actually their need of Achilles is being artificially manufactured by the Zeus of will through the prayer of Thetis. But if you look down around like 820, right, 3 times Patroclus charged the gut of the high wall. 3 times Apollo battered the man and hurled him back, the gods' immortal hands beating down on the gleaming shield. And then at Patroclus' 4th assault, like something superhuman, the god shrieked down his winging words of terror. Back, Patroclus, prince, go back. It is not the will of fate that the proud Trojan citadel fall before your spear, not even before Achilles, far greater man than you. So there's a lot happening here. So the first thing that I'd point out is, one, Apollo's the one who actually has to step. It's not Hector, right? It's Apollo that has to step in and actually stop Patroclus from taking this. 2, we get this. I don't think Homer gives us a whole lot of unnecessary details. And so what caught my imagination here is the 3-4. Why does it record that 3 times he did this, and on the 4th time this happened, right? We haven't, going by memory, I don't think we've really seen this kind of pattern pop up. And so it was something that kind of I marked as I was reading. Thirdly, right, we see it's not the will of fate. So again, we get this idea of like, so here Apollo it seems to be an agent of a fate, saying, hey, you're not called to do this, therefore you can't do it. Regardless of your human agency, regardless of the fact that you might actually just sack Troy right now if I got out of the way. It is not your fate to do this. Then, even in a more kind of revelatory way, he then tells us what?
Not even before Achilles.
It's not even Achilles' fate
Right.
to take Troy. So then we're really confused. Like, well, okay, Patroclus is going to take Troy. Achilles isn't going to take Troy, but Troy's doomed to fall. So there's just like this little line, in here, right? The citadel before your spear, not even before Achilles, a far greater man than you. So Troy's not even slotted by fate to fall to Achilles, which then raises all kinds of questions about, where's the narrative going, and et cetera. But just like this one little line, right? If anyone didn't notice that, I think it's an important thing to mention. But the reason I want to focus on the 3-4 is because then if you, let's see here, go to like 9:13.
9:13. Okay.
So if you look at, so this is the death of Patroclus.
3 times. Okay.
Right? Yeah. What ends up happening here? So this is where 3 times he charged with the headlong speed of Ares, screaming his savage cry. 3 times he killed 9 men. Then at the 4th assault, Patroclus, like something superhuman, this is all sounding very familiar. Then Patroclus, the end of life came blazing up before you. Yes, the Lord Apollo met you there in the heart of battle, and then basically he sneaks up behind him and slammed his broad shoulders with the back of the god's flat hand, right? Like very just ignoble for multiple reasons, right? And his eyes spun as Apollo knocked the helmet off his head. So I see this very much as the reason Homer's giving us this detail is, Patroclus is bumping up against fate, right? And it just seems to be no matter how much you kick out against this, you can't actually, at least not in a significant way, change this fate. Yeah. And so it connects the pattern between Patroclus trying to deny fate, right, the 3-4 pattern that Apollo does this, to then when he gets struck down by the gods, it follows that 3-4 pattern again. And I think this is communicating to us a certain way of what happens, right, when you test fate. It's also, I think, communicating to us just an incredibly deterministic, fatalistic narrative, right? Because like, what more could Patroclus do?
Right. I mean, you're feeling sorry for him over and over again, right?
Because like Apollo is punishing him for pushing. I mean, think about like being between a rock and a hard place. Apollo is punishing him, right, in the name of fate for pushing up against Troy, and he's just kind of just slapped down like a backhand, right?
Right.
But why is he pushing up against Troy? Because he's being overpowered by the will of Zeus. So on one hand, he's being crushed, right, between the will of the gods, right, and also this fate. Does that make sense? Because he's also being pushed up against Troy by the will of Zeus. It's already told us that, right? That why did he not listen to Achilles? Because the will of Zeus overpowers him. And then he just gets crushed in the middle of this. So I think that, you can certainly feel, I think, bad, right, for Patroclus, but I think as far as that he deserved his fate, my inclination there is yes. And the reason I mention that is just simply because I think that he ultimately fails in his purpose in the Iliad to temper Achilles' rage, and then he becomes a vehicle. I mean, he gets basically inverted and used for the complete opposite, and then becomes a vehicle for Achilles' rage in the latter half of the narrative.
Right, because he also, so he didn't listen to what Achilles said either, right? So Achilles says, only go so far and then stop. And he moves, and he crosses that line. But I also, again, maybe just a charitable read, I don't know, but I feel for Patroclus when you're in the battle, like when you're in, you have this rage going, like everything is going well for you, right? Like for the most part, except for the whole God smacking you down over and over again. But
except for that small part.
Except for that part. But even in there, it gives the litany of basically all the people he kills, right? That Patroclus kills before all this happens, and it's a big kill spree.
Correct.
So like you can see, he's having a lot of success over and over again, and so I could see how you would get a little carried away, a little maybe prideful, because things are going well.
So yeah, we kind of pulled that thread, right? Does Patroclus deserve his fate? So let's kind of go back and join the narrative and see what other thread here that we can pull. So Patroclus is getting everything together. We get this long narrative of all the Myrmidons coming together and their battalions and things like this. So if you look at like line 260, the next thing that really caught my attention is Achilles offers a libation, right? So this libation is right, a liquid sacrifice. We've seen this before, right? They pour out, right, really literally to pour one out to the gods, right? So they pour out, usually if they're like at a feast, something like this, right? They'll pour out the first glass of wine, right, to the gods, right? So it's literally a liquid sacrifice. This one just caught my attention because, Achilles sends Patroclus out, and then he actually goes into this ritual. And there's several things that I noted about it. One is that usually when we see this is like as I mentioned, a feast, right? They're all about the drink, and they say, okay, let's pour this out. This is not in the context of the feast. This is actually a very intentional libation, right? Separated from any type of other eating or feasting. And notice too, he pulls this cup, this well-wrought cup, right, from this princely inlaid sea chest. This thing is a chalice. Its only purpose is to pour out a libation to the gods, right? Because he doesn't drink from it. He doesn't have a feast. He doesn't do anything with it. He simply uses it
and then puts it back up.
Yep. He pours out the wine in his libation. He says his prayer, and then he puts it back up, right? I mean, I think the reason this caught my attention, and of course then he prays, and only half his prayer, right, can be answered, because he prays that Patroclus can push them off the ships and that he returns home safe. And Zeus will only answer half his prayer. But I think too, this kind of gives us a little bit of an insight, and I think this will develop in the narrative, is that Achilles' relationship to the gods, and that he seems to have a somewhat intimate and somewhat very prudent understanding of how the gods function, right? So he's having this, I think very kind of intimate and very intentional libation. You also see him at the beginning of the book, as we mentioned earlier, when like Athena comes in and stops him, right? He knows her voice. He knows it's immediately Athena. He defers to her. And I think as the narrative goes on, we're going to see that as much as we want to fault Achilles, he does seem to have a certain sensitivity to the divine will and how that should actually be played out in the politics of the gods.
Well, and like you said, or I don't remember if you said this or not. Sorry, if you did, we can move on. But did you actually say that he prayed for that Patroclus will survive?
Yeah, he says right there at like 291, right?
Right.
But once he repels the roaring onslaught from the ships, let him come back to me and our fast fleet unharmed, with all my armor around him, all comrades fighting around my friend. And then Homer's pretty explicit here, right? One prayer the father granted, the other he denied.
Right.
Right.
This right here also kind of goes against my thought process of Achilles looking out at the battlefield, seeing Patroclus out there and saying, okay, I want to go in with him. Because like he's praying for his, that he survives, that he comes back. Right.
But I mean, no, I think your insight's good though, because there'd be a natural intuition there that, we get this thing that Patroclus is a deep, deep friend of Achilles, right? They have this deep, abiding friendship. At least from Achilles' standpoint, that's how he views it, right?
Right.
There might be how Patroclus views that might be slightly different, but how Achilles views this is my friend. And so I think it's a natural institution that then he would see his friend out fighting and might want to do something. Now, some pushback on that would be he just gave his armor to his friend. What's he going to win? Let's run out, in his skivvies and his spear that he has and go for it. Which for Achilles actually might...
And you know what? The Greeks have done things like that before,
Right. It's not like outside the realm of like a reasonable opportunities. But yeah, no, so I wouldn't give up on that too fast. I mean, I think sometimes we have to take into account that because of Achilles' rage, which is very much intimately intertwined with his pride, he tends to act in inhuman ways. Right. Ways that we think like, how is this not moving him? Or why would he do this? Or why would he do that? Because even like if you have this certain intimacy, with Patroclus, right, this deep abiding friendship, like really, like even you're even self-aware to admit that the reason you won't do this is simply because of the pride that you swore to Agamemnon.
Right.
So you're going to send him out. See, there's things that are kind of grading on whether this is true friendship, etc. And the only way I think to read some of these things is just to take quite seriously the level of depth and intensity of Achilles' rage, right? All right.
But a very human aspect right there of him praying to the gods, like understanding, the authority of the gods, how that works, and praying for his friend to survive.
Correct. Yeah.
Which we don't see very often. So.
Not from him. So, okay. So let's turn. So he goes out, and so he leaves the Achaeans he leaves the Achaeans to push back the Trojans from the ships. We get around like 440. This is where their formations are wrecked. They're pushing back. By the way, this is where that prophesied dust storm becomes true. If you remember, Ajax talked about a dust storm would come up. I think Polydamas talked about a dust storm would come up when they finally pushed us back. Right, we're going to have this full-blown retreat.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
Here it is, right? This is a little after 440, right? The dust storm has finally come, which the dust storm is caused by the Trojans just full-on retreating back to Troy, right? One thing I would note here is we get this thing where Hector, right? So Ajax has come up. Hector, so this is like 425 or so. Hector knew full well the tide of battle had turned, right? Patroclus is leading this onslaught, but still stood firm, defending his die-hard comrades.
Yeah, there's courage there for sure.
There is. And then literally not even like 6 lines down, right? Zeus enters in, right, and causes a rout. And Homer like very clearly lays this on thick. And Hector's speeding horses swept him away, armor and all, leaving his men to face their fate. Trojans trapped, but struggling on in the deep trench, right? And he's kind of whisked away. Now, some of this can say like, well, was he a coward? Did Zeus take over his, horses? Like, what's actually happening here? But there's a certain juxtaposition here that Homer's really presenting to us, right? That Hector wanted to stay, right? He was going to hold the line. Zeus enters, and now next thing we know is Hector's chariot's taking him back to Troy, and his men are dying in the ditch.
Yeah. Okay. So the pushback would be, okay, Hector, again, knew full well the tide had turned. So the gods have shifted here, and he wants to stay. And then, like all of a sudden, that storm cloud rises up, and maybe he loses that courage that he had and runs away.
He could. Yeah. It's less clear in that one, right?
And I'm not necessarily taking that position. I'm just saying, like, I remember reading through this thinking, like, is that what happened? Or was it that he didn't have actually control of doing that? Yeah,
because Homer makes this line, I think there's another one that's a little bit more clear, but he makes this one a little bit ambiguous by saying, right, Hector's speeding horses swept him away, right? As if this is something happening to Hector,
him,
right? As opposed to Hector, falling into cowardice. So let's look at Sarpedon, our boy Sarpedon, which I actually really liked. I liked Sarpedon. I was sad to see him die. If you remember, he's a son of Zeus. He was the first one, remember, to kind of wrench a hole in the Achaean wall, right, the rampart that they had built up. He gives in that moment a wonderful speech to Glaucus about like, hey, we're the rulers of our people, right? We have the largest states, we have the flocks. This is what we're called to do.
This is what we're born for.
Yeah, we're called to glory. We're called to give our lives. I mean, it's kind of this beautiful understanding of leadership and authority, right? That, this is what I'm actually called to do. And he does it, right? He's denied the glory of going through the wall first, right? Hector gets that with the, crashing the boulder and other such things. But I think his little speech that he gives there is an important one. And I think one the West picks on pretty heavily, particularly if you get into like the medieval age, right, about how to view authority and knighthood and chivalry and things like this, right? What are you actually called to do? So, but
my only dislike of Sarpedon is that he is Hera's favorite.
He is,
and I don't like Hera, and so if Hera likes somebody, then I don't like them. You know what I mean? Like that's my only dig at Sarpedon. It's not his fault.
I mean, so here's what. So let me kind of, let me kind of use this as an opportunity, I think, to jump into what I mentioned earlier is what is then the relationship. There's kind of cascading relationships in this book of agency. And I think one of them here that is kind of debated often is that this passage about Sarpedon is debated a lot again, when we turn to the conversation of what is the distinction between the will of Zeus, right, and fate. Because let's see what he says, right? So Zeus, so this is like we're left at 5:10. And Zeus, the son of Cronos, with Cronos' twisting ways, which I think is a loaded epithet there, feeling with pity, now to see the two great fighters, said to Hera, his sister and his wife, my cruel fate, my Sarpedon, the man I love the most, my own son, doomed to die at the hands of Patroclus, my heart is torn in two as I try to weigh all this. Shall I pluck him up now while he's still alive and set him down in the rich green land of Lycia, far away from the war at Troy and all its tears, or beat him down at Patroclus' hand at last? So let me kind of turn to our guide because there's a lot of commentary on this passage. So we see Zeus lament his cruel fate and his son Sarpedon having to die to bring about the death of Patroclus. Knox, so Knox actually is the one, this is the translation by Fagles. Knox is the one who does the introduction, right? So again, one of the reasons I recommend this text, I think it's a good one. So Knox holds that this shows that the will of Zeus is thwarted by fate. So he sees these two things as antagonistic, right? Okay. That here we see very clearly that Zeus is lamenting what fate has like in store for him, right? Knox writes that the will of Zeus and this nameless destiny are irreconcilable, but are actually held in coexistence. So he tends to hold, and I see this theory a lot, that you really cannot peel these two apart, right? In Homer's Iliad is a very fatalistic and deterministic book. Like it just kind of is on its face, right? There's a lot of questions of like we just mentioned with Patroclus, where is human agency? what is the ambit of human agency, right? How much can you actually do in the will of the gods? It's a beautiful text to read and start this conversation because this is a if you want to say a perennial topic, right? That's going to be picked up by the great books of the Western world is what is the relationship between man's will and God's will, right? Do we have any free will? Do we have free agency? So here Knox is saying, listen, you really can't peel these two apart. They're conflated in the Iliad. Like Zeus seems subject to fate at times. Other times he's not. They're kind of held in this tension and this coexistence. And there's not going to be a passage here that really says, we finally have solved it, right? He sees, in this, like I said, a nascent discussion of the West to embrace the logical contradiction of freedom and order combined. That is a loaded statement. Yeah. Because I think, not to jump ahead, just a few thousand years, right? But this question is one. I mean, what we're seeing is here, you could say like, okay, the narrative like Zeus and the fate, like why does this matter? Well, this does get picked up very heavily, right? You see it picked up even by the pagans with like Aristotle, but then you are going to have a lot of questions, say with like St. Augustine, right? What is the relationship of God's will and divine providence?
Free will and grace.
Right? Yep. What is that actual relationship? And I think that then you see kind of a very beautiful answer be given to the West there in Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, right? He's in prison. Lady Philosophy comes to talk to him.
Are you going to be able to read that one? How long until we read that one?
About a decade. We'll get there in about a decade. Everyone just hang in. We're going to get there.
I'm going to be
right.
almost 50 years
right.
old.
The year of Boethius in 10 years. Here we go. So, and then Boethius, Thomas Aquinas is downstream of him, right? Because Boethius is, forgive me, right? He's 400s, 500s. He's after St. Augustine. And then Thomas Aquinas is clearly downstream of him, right? Because Thomas is writing in the 1200s. But if you go and read where Thomas talks about the relationship, right, between like our free will, how do we have free will, and God has his providence, he relies a lot on Boethius. And so this conversation that matures deeply in the West, and still a conversation we have today, right? You're going to talk to your Calvinist friends, they're going to have a different understanding. You're going to talk to your Muslim friends, they're going to have a different understanding. This conversation that's matured very deeply in the West, and that is still very much debated, right, is nascent, sometimes in a comical way, here with Zeus. But it comes up somewhat in a somewhat intimate way here, because Zeus is here lamenting the death of his own son, right? So,
and Hera gives this like super passive aggressive like response, in my opinion.
She does, and I think that's actually worth looking at. So, yeah, because many will note that both Zeus and Hera seem to assume that Zeus can change Sarpedon's doom, sealed long ago, but that doing so would introduce chaos. The scene is reminiscent of Zeus holding out the golden scales in Book 8. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. So if we talk about like the relationship between Zeus and fate, there's usually two main passages, at least where we are in the text, that people look to. One is the death of Sarpedon and how Zeus kind of laments this. And so it's like, well, is something happening to Zeus? If something's happening to him, right, what is his agency, right, in this concept?
His unmoved mover.
Right. And the other one is the scales of fate, right, where he kind of holds out these scales of fate to say, okay, who's going to win or lose? And I think these are the two main passages that people, point to. And I think the question really, right, is fate simply an alter ego of Zeus, a manifestation of his will, or is Zeus truly subject in some way to a nameless fate? Mm-hmm. We should also recall, which I think is really important, that I think you also have to keep in mind Zeus conquered. Zeus conquered by love and sleep.
Yes.
So if the fate is simply just like his alter ego, right, they're actually one and the same, that raises a lot of questions then about how he can be conquered by anything else. And we saw...
Maybe bipolar.
He could be, right? But we saw these kind of like primordial gods pop up, right? Of like...
He does kind of act like it sometimes. I mean...
He's capricious.
Yeah, he's
right?
capricious.
I would say that. The gods are fickle, right?
Yeah.
But we see then Zeus conquered by love and fate. And so again, then we're like, love and sleep. And so we're kind of like, well, if he can be conquered by those, what about this nameless fate that seems to move everything on?
Yeah.
So, but I think there's some pushback on this. I mean, one of them is you should remember that when Zeus gives his assent, he can't change his decision, right? He gives that nod, like he gives the nod to Thetis. And thus, his own will manufactures a particular fate to which he's bound. So this only becomes more complicated. So if you remember, we talked about why the Greeks, when they give these sacrifices, they're allowed to keep the choice meats for themselves, but they can offer the bones kind of wrapped in fat to Zeus, even though Zeus realizes that wasn't the best portion. Well, it's because he was originally tricked and gave his assent. So now Zeus is bound to a fate that he himself somewhat created. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the layers of the onion here just kind of keep pulling back. And so this is why a lot of people are like, listen, now Latimer, whose translation that we reference sometimes, Latimer's on the other side. Completely 100%, he says, fate is simply an alter ego of Zeus. Okay. And Latimer's opinion is that his translation is kind of the seminal translation. It's one of the ones a lot of people use. It's a good translation. So for him to say that is not a small thing, right? But I tend to more gravitate towards, there's a lot here I'm not entirely sure you can extricate from one another. And I really enjoyed, Knox has that quote, which I think is really good, which he says, the idea of destiny in the Iliad, of what is fixed, is flexible. Right? So there's like this fate that comes in, like Troy's going to fall, but then it's kind of like, flexible as well. And you see this actually, there's a line in Book 16 that really points this out, in which right before Patroclus is going to die, right, he's fated to die. Zeus is sitting there, and it says he's churning out all the ways that Patroclus could die. Mm-hmm. And that kind of gives that example of like there's a fixed fate. Patroclus will die.
Like, he's going to die. It's just
right.
The variable is how is he going to do it?
Right. So but there still seems to be somewhat malleable, right, to the will of Zeus.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would be like one thread you could pull out of Book 16. I think another one, so if this kind of cascades down, right, and to a certain degree we've touched on this, but I think it's worth exploring and looking more in Book 16, is on one level you have the relationship between the gods and fate, and on the next level you have what observations can be kind of gleaned from Book 16 on the relationship between fate or gods and the will of men. Right. So do you want to lead us maybe through that a little bit? Do you see that question on our guide? What observations may be made?
Observations may be made between fate and the will of men. Hector, who is acted upon often by the gods, occasions several examples in Book 16 of the dynamics between the will of man and the will of the gods. First, observe that upon the Achaean advance, Hector, who knows the tide has turned, still stood firm, defending die-hard comrades, like we talked about.
Right.
Then Zeus sends the cyclones to produce the foretold dust storm, and Hector's horses speed away as his fellow Trojans die.
So that one, as we noted, is somewhat ambiguous, right? Like so we see an interjection of Zeus there, but then it kind of seems like something is happening to Hector, right? His horses. So I think that one's somewhat a little bit more vague. But then book 16
to face their fate. Yeah, so that's interesting. So it's leaving his men to face their fate.
Right.
So like leaving them, to actually die.
Correct. So not only what's happening to Hector, but then like what has been foreordained by those men. And so the question here, because I think that even in our Sunday Great Books group, one of the big debates here has been what is the culpability of Hector, right? So is he a coward? Is he also capricious in certain ways? Sometimes he stands, sometimes he doesn't, right? And I think that this one's a little bit ambiguous, but the next one, which is
there's another example that's a little bit more
right. So lead us into that. That's around 700, 760.
Yeah, 760. I think 763 is where you have it here. It says, for a more explicit example, Zeus begins the work of Patroclus' death by making Hector a coward. So
much more clear.
Yeah, so
it's actually that's
763.
Yes, and that's actually it says so verbatim in the Fagel's translation. So he's about to understand how do I start the process of Patroclus dying, and he says, and Zeus began with Hector. He made the man a coward. I mean, just very explicitly, right? He just acts upon him, and then of course, like immediately, Hector's shouting out, retreat, fall back.
Yeah, so then Hector, however, appears aware that Zeus is acting upon him in 766. And Homer tells us that Patroclus might have escaped his doom if he had listened to Achilles, but ultimately the will of Zeus will always overpower the will of men, like we talked about.
Yeah, so both here, right, in both Patroclus and Hector in book 16, you see the gods acting upon them. And the question is, what is the actual level of culpability for their actions? So as we talked to Patroclus, he seems to get crushed on one hand between the will of Zeus and the will of Apollo. Apollo, though, saying that he's acting as this agent of fate. And then also with Hector, right, you get a very clear, like, he's making me a coward. But as you mentioned, it's interesting that Hector is aware that he's being acted upon, right? Hector is aware, even the sense of crying out retreat, he's aware that he has been made a coward. And I think that's a fascinating deal that he has the sensitivity to understand this is actually happening to me.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, he says he knew that Zeus had tipped the scales against him.
Right. So, I mean, just as far as like we're kind of tracking like the will of the gods, via the will of men. So here I'll take the next one. So it says, similarly, as Patroclus attempts to assault Troy, Apollo repels him and says it's not the will of fate that Troy fall to him, right? And then we also, as we mentioned, he also says it's not the fate to Achilles either. As Patroclus lays dying, he is cognizant of what has happened to him. So there's a parallel here between Hector and Patroclus, right? So Hector knows that Zeus has acted on him and make a coward as Patroclus lays dying. So this is like the very last page of, this is at 993, right? Line 993. This is the very last page. Patroclus is very much aware, right? Hector's kind of goading him, which we can kind of debate what we think about that. But he says, deadly fate in league with Apollo killed me. I mean, just a kind of a loaded phrase of like, here's Hector kind of saying like, hey, like triumphing over Patroclus. And Patroclus, in the midst of being slapped and falling down and being stabbed, twice, is actually aware of, no, this was Apollo, right? It was Apollo in league with fate as an agent of fate. So book 16 continues to present fate as deterministic over the actions of man. Though some men may be aware of fate, or the gods as an agent of fate have acted upon them, right, as we see Apollo do. And I think that you can also recall that Hector has confidence that no man can take him before fate allows, right? He said that when he visited his wife, which I think is really important. And moreover, Achilles and that other man, who I cannot remember his name, his father was a seer or a prophet. There's only two people we've seen thus far that actually can, we would say, change their fate. Remember, like Achilles gets the promise, or not the promise of Thetis, but you can either stay here right?
Yeah, the dichotomy of you can either do this or this.
Right. You can either stay here and fight in Troy and you'll live forever through your glory, right? You'll have this certain immortality. Or you can go back and get married and you'll have a long, happy life, but then no one remembers your name, right? And then we also had that similar narrative of the individual that was the son of the seer, and he could either... His was less wonderful, right? You can either die in your house of a plague or you could go die in Troy, right? But even then, it's not... I would push back a little bit because... it's still fate that gives them the choice, right? It's not that they kind of arrest an opportunity from fate and merits, does it make sense? They're not like meriting some kind of like option. It's like for whatever reason, fate decides that they have some type of choice. Right. So even in that, it's fate. It's fatalistic that they have the choice. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I just think that there's this kind of relationship between fate and the gods really just kind of cascades down through book 16. And I hope gives some context to why then we have this somewhat lackluster, ignoble death of Patroclus, right? I think it's really a commentary on fate.
Now, in our small group that we had on our Sunday Great Books group, we had some who were really upset with how Hector responded to Patroclus's last words, right? Because here, and this is maybe and to their defense, maybe you don't see Hector play this role very often, but glorious Hector, this is around 1005 or so. It says, but glorious Hector taunted Patroclus's body dead as he was. So I think there was a hang-up in our group, or at least a discussion that says like, well, hold on a minute, why is Hector acting this way? Like, he just killed Patroclus. That should have been enough. Patroclus is a very well-known warrior. Like, he knew it was Patroclus. He killed Patroclus. But then he goes off and taunts his dead body, which we know in the book. I mean, we're very clear that the honoring the dead bodies is a very important thing, right? I mean, and we'll continue to learn more and more about this as we go. Especially with Patroclus's body, but honoring the dead and honoring somebody's body after they die is something of honor and is worth. And so it seems a little counterintuitive or a little odd that we see Hector doing this here. What were your thoughts when you read that?
Yeah, one, I think there's an internal book parallel between how Patroclus's body then is treated at the end and how he claimed he wanted to treat Sarpedon's body. Right? So if you remember that, like, because Patroclus is maybe even more explicit than Hector, right? We have to charge, we have to do this. Why? Because, I mean, he explicitly states, like, we want to mutilate him, right? Not only just drag his body off and get his armor, we want to mutilate the body of Sarpedon. Because why? He was the first one to storm the Argive wall, right? So we owe him, this kind of dishonor. And then very clearly, as you mentioned, right, there's how we treat the dead. Like the rituals we give them is a strong sub-theme inside of the Iliad, right? That really actually gives a lot of context and a lot of structure to the overall narrative. And so there with Sarpedon, we see that the gods, right, Zeus, his like kind of compromises. He doesn't jump in to save Sarpedon, right? But then he does pull his body out, right? Or has his body pulled out and kind of sent back, to be taken care of, right? And then so the body then actually can get his full ritualistic burial. Right. So here then, I think we have a parallel that then Patroclus, who earlier was calling for the mutilation of Sarpedon's body, is now hearing that his body will be mutilated, right? Because if I remember right, Hector, he talks about that, the beasts, right, are going to, eat you and do this, and you'll be left for fodder out in the field. And then the vultures are going to eat you raw. And then I can't remember looking at really quickly if he makes it overly explicit, but one of the things that he also wants to do is decapitate Patroclus, right? If it's not in this passage, it becomes very clear in the next book that's part of what he's actually threatening, right? He wants to decapitate Patroclus, and his body gets eaten by things, and the head will probably get put on the wall, right?
Yeah, so, and I can. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, like, I can see that in war, right? You're fighting somebody, or he's about to die, or something like that, and you're like, one of the last things you're saying is like you're taking digs at him, right? Or like to also scare the other army members or the other people in the army, like that's pretty intimidating. But it's another thing I think too. At the end, like he's already dead at this point. It's one thing to kind of like say it as you're fighting, because you can probably say some weird things while you're fighting, I would imagine.
Right.
Like I've never fought to the death with anybody that anybody knows about.
It's a good caveat.
But I can imagine your emotion. You're just kind of, you say things that you probably wouldn't say normally. I can get that.
Right.
But then he goes on, and he places his heel in Patroclus's chest. Kind of like stomping it down, and it just seems uncharacteristic of Hector. Do you think that this is Hector's character, or do you think that this is kind of payback from the will of the god, like fate?
Right.
Kind of like what you're talking about.
I think that let me give a small defense, I guess, of Hector.
And I'm not saying that I'm not going after Hector here. I'm just saying, like, it just seemed.
No, that's how I read you. Just absolutely anti.
Just anti-Hector.
Just anti-Hector.
Sealing my fate,
right?
Or my hate for Hector. No, I just want to know.
No,
it just seems a little.
Well, I think that some guys, when they approach the text, right, this kind of goes back to one of the sub themes, one of really the perennial conversations, right? If one perennial conversation that the West will pick up that starts here in the Iliad is the relationship between the will of God and the will of man, another conversation that picks up is what is an excellent man? What is virtue, right? This is something that we've been tracking, is like, what is virtue? And so we've kind of thrown out a thesis in a lot of these ways that I think that, Homer is offering his aristocratic Greek audience somewhat of a foil to Achilles, right? Achilles is kind of like the natural hero of the tale. He's who we hear about at the beginning. He's going to come out and win the war, things like this. So then who's Hector? And why is Hector so often contrasted with Achilles, right? And so a lot of people are going to point there to say, if we read Homer not very, in a flat manner, but more dynamic, then do we see Homer maybe offering us a moral comparison to Achilles in Hector? So when Achilles is over on the beach, angry about Briseis and getting mad about his pride and his slave girl and everything else, Hector's going home and being pious towards the gods and offering sacrifices, clearly caring about Troy and his men, right? He has a piety towards the polis,
right,
and then he's caring for his family. And so even in our group, maybe we leaned into heavily, which is maybe part of the problem. There's like this, for some people, in anticipation that like, oh, Hector then is the virtuous character. And then I think we saw some people choke on this of like, well, this is not how a virtuous man treats the dying, right? First off, bud, I'm not really sure how much you did here, right? Like Apollo slapped him down. Euphorbus, or whatever his name is, just kind of ran him, stabbed him, and ran away, which is kind of it's comical as it is just like ignoble, right? That you just get stabbed. And then Hector comes in and just stabs you deep in the bowels and then starts taunting you, and you're sitting here dying, trying to figure out what just happened, right? Going from about to take Troy and fighting a god to just like lying out, dying. Also being stabbed in the bowels is not a quick, wonderful way to go, right?
No.
So, then you get the taunting, like you've mentioned. So in one hand, there's two things that occur to me.
Okay.
One is that
what's the second one first?
David. First one's virtue. The second one's David.
I was going to try to throw you off, man. You were already on. That was awesome.
So
no way I could have done that.
This is. It's just one of the things that I'm thinking about, and I think it raises questions. I'm not saying it's like here's the answer, but one is like you have to meet Homer. So let's just say we have a really rich, thick understanding of Homer, and say we actually believe the divine providence is working through Homer, right? Not in the same way he works through the Hebrews with like inspired scripture, but that God is actually using Homer and then subsequently the Greek culture to till the soil, to eventually come into contact with Hebrew faith, and then that actually prepares the world to receive Jesus Christ, right? That we, just like, Homer is basically the Genesis of the Greeks, right? We're going to start reading the Hebrew tradition with Genesis, we're going to start reading the Greek tradition with Homer. We truly believe that something's actually happening here. And so one of the things that we think is that, divine providence, right? That there's intentionality here, that certain questions are being raised that are going to start to prepare man to actually receive Jesus Christ. And even if you kind of somewhat chunk that out the window and say, well, I don't believe in that intentionality on divine providence, or that's an overly religious reading of this or whatever, I don't think you can escape the fact that certain conversations that matured in the West start in this book. whether we like it or not, right?
Oh, yeah.
And one of those conversations is, what does it mean to be an excellent man? What is virtue? But I think we have to understand and be careful that we don't read Homer back through the virtue tradition of, say, Aquinas, St. Augustine, Aristotle, and Plato. Because if we do and we look at some of these acts, you're like, Hector, what are you doing?
Right.
But if we look at it as this is the beginning of the conversation, right? We're really starting to say, what does it mean to be an excellent man? And really the conversation before us is just being good at war, like Achilles.
Right.
That's actual virtue, right? Or is like Hector having broader considerations and say piety and virtue towards the gods, the Polis and his family, part of being an excellent man as well. And what I mean by that is that you have to just meet the text where it is in the conversation of virtue, and this is nascent. It's just starting. So that's the first thing I think to think about is just like, where are we actually in the conversation of virtue? We're real early.
Right.
So some of these things of like, well, I don't think you should have treated the body like that. I don't think you should have done that in the middle of a war. Like, I don't think you should taunt him. I have some problems with that. Sure. Secondly, I think that even if you come, say...
I like your second point. Like, I think that's a great point. I think that's like, I agree with you 100%. I think this one is even better.
Okay, well, that's good. Because then I think the thing that occurs to me is that a lot of people who would bring, say, a heavy critique, so say you're coming from a strong virtue mindset, and therefore you bring a heavy critique and lay it at Hector's feet about how he's acting in here, right? Like, he shouldn't have done this. He should have done the taunting, like to say you'll mutilate a body. Like, really, he's becoming vicious, right? Then I think one of the problems or things to think about is that Hector's taunting of Patroclus is pretty much the same, if not less severe, than David's taunting of Goliath in the Hebrew narratives, right, inside 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I think that really raises a lot of questions because a lot of people that might be particularly coming from a Christian background, are going to be very eager to say, Hector's not a hero, you can't be a hero, you cannot act like this. Need to go back and read David and Goliath. Because yes, David does say, going by memory, Goliath says, I'm going to feed you to the birds. Am I a dog that you come to me with a stick? Right? And you say, oh, Goliath says that. And David says, right, like, well, you might come with me a sword and shield, but I come, right, in the name of the Lord, right? Yeah, that's true, but you got to look at the broader context. He also says, I will feed you to the animals, right? And I will cut off your head. And the difference between Hector and David is that David then, clearly kills Goliath. And then he does mutilate his body. He takes Goliath's sword and cuts off Goliath's head, feeds his body to the birds, the Philistines retreat, and then David takes his head and goes and puts it on like the city gate in Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah, on a pike or something like, yeah.
Yeah, so part of the question here is like, obviously there's a maturation of virtue in the Old Testament as well, right? As that divine pedagogy is revealing more and more about God as we go through, not like in a contradictory way, but obviously like God reveals himself more and more as we go through, right? So if you look at like what Noah knew as opposed to like Moses receives like the name at the burning bush, they get the 10 Commandments, they understand how to do sacrifices, like things of this nature, right? This it kind of matures as you move through the Old Testament. Then you still have that same argument that virtue is maturing, but I don't think any of us would then step back and be like, you know what? David's not a hero.
Right.
You shouldn't emulate him, right? King David's not a hero. Actually, we get that David is a man after God's own heart. And I'm pretty sure, could be wrong, I'm happy to receive some, chastisement on Twitter from the biblical scholars. David has never asked to apologize for that, right? He's not like he has to go and then like go give sacrifice later because, hey, you weren't supposed to mutilate the body of Goliath. I mean, he's praised for it and given gifts for it and everything else. So I do think we have to kind of keep in context when we come to these.
I think that those two go really hand in hand.
And they're actually not that far away time period wise either, right? They're both Bronze Age. What did we say? You can go look at the guide for the details because actually I think I opened the guide talking about this comparison just because most people I think might be more familiar with the King David, King Saul narrative. And so if I recall correctly, Troy falls at 1150, right? Homer's writing in like 850, but Troy probably falls around 1150. The narrative of King David is just shortly after that because like you can look at the zenith of his reign is at 1000 BC. So they're very close.
A couple hundred years.
Right, if you're actually looking here about like how the cultures act and things of that nature. So I do think that I give, obviously like I tend to always find a way to defend Hector, so that's my own bias. But I do think that if we're going
to give a defense of Nestor.
I will actually defer to you always on that point. That's fine. But I just do think that if we're going to try and meet Homer where he is, and we're seeing this virtue tradition start, then we also need to be somewhat fair when we look at the Hebrew tradition and say, well, are we actually being fair to Hector as we look at like our own, King David or another like, Hebrew figure? I mean, a lot of the people in the Old Testament, right, acted in certain ways that, raise questions.
Man, a lot happened in book 16. There's a lot going on. It was one of those, by the time it was over, even though there's parts of it I was a little bit, disappointed in, it was like good. It was still satisfying that things were happening.
Yeah, no, it's a good book. It's hopefully like if you're reading and you thought it was dragging a little bit, the pace is going to pick up here pretty quick. Right. Obviously now we're kind of waiting with bated breath for Achilles to find out what has happened to Patroclus. Right. Shocker, it's probably not going to go over well.
Yeah.
Right?
Remember the whole rage thing?
Right. So anyway, we continue our year of Homer. We continue reading the Iliad. I'm very much enjoying it.
Yeah. Hopefully you guys had a good discussion there in your small groups as you guys read this as well. Go check us out on our website for our guide. We really leaned heavy on our guide today. And so if you enjoyed the conversation, go check that out because you can basically have that discussion with your small group and see what your friends had to say about it. And sounds super smart.
Yeah.
So and that's what it's all about.
Very good.
And the hokey pokey.
All
right. We'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.